This man is about to spend 4 months of his salary on a watch that a Swiss factory worker assembled in 45 minutes. He saw on social media that it's an investment piece that will hold its value and even double it. But what he doesn't know is that he's participating in one of the most successful schemes in luxury goods history. What he's buying is a manufactured fantasy that's been 100 years in the making. This is the story of how luxury brands use human insecurity to build a $50 billion empire on lies. But to understand how we got here, we need to travel back to when telling time was impossible. It's around the year 1510 in Nuremberg, Germany. Most people have no idea what time it is unless they hear church bells ringing. But at a local locksmith shop, a man named Peter Henlin created something the world had never seen before. A portable timepiece small enough to fit in your pocket, yet it cost as much as a house. Only kings and nobles could afford them. But by the early 1800s, pocket watches weren't just timepieces. They were status symbols. Owning a quality watch meant you were successful, punctual, and sophisticated. But pocket watches have a major flaw, and when the world went to war, that flaw became a life or death problem. In 1904, the Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos Dumont had a problem. He tried flying experimental aircraft, but realized that checking his pocket watch meant taking his hands off the controls. That's when his friend, Louis Cartier, came up with a brilliant solution. Cartier created the Santos watch, a timepiece designed specifically for the wrist. For the first time in history, a man could check the time without stopping what he's doing. But despite the advantage of this in everyday life, the wrist design wasn't popular. Most men thought wristwatches were feminine accessories, and that real men used pocket watches. That was the popular belief until a global catastrophe would make millions of men choose between their pride and their lives. From 1914 to 1918, millions of soldiers discovered that you can't check the time while holding a rifle, throwing a grenade, or coordinating an attack. Pocket watches were completely useless in combat. Soldiers started adapting their pocket watches with wire lugs to wear on their wrists. These trench watches became essential survival equipment, and this was the opportunity that a young German entrepreneur had been waiting for. In 1905, Hans Wilsdorf established a company called Wilsdorf & Davis, where he imported Swiss watch mechanisms and assembled them into quality cases. 3 years later, he renamed it to Rolex with one vision: to create reliable wristwatches. And in 1910, Rolex received the first Swiss certificate of chronometric precision ever awarded to a wristwatch. Wilsdorf proved that wristwatches can be just as accurate as pocket watches. And when World War I ended, millions of soldiers returned home wearing wristwatches. They weren't feminine anymore. They were practical, masculine, and modern. But Wilsdorf wasn't just building watches, he was building something much more powerful. In 1926, most watches were fragile instruments that broke if exposed to moisture, but Wilsdorf created something different, a watch that could survive the elements. That same year, Rolex introduced the Oyster case, the first truly waterproof wristwatch. Everyone was skeptical about the waterproof claim and didn't want to risk buying it. He needed to prove it to the world. 1 year later, a British swimmer named Mercedes Galitz attempted to swim the English Channel wearing a Rolex Oyster around her neck. Mercedes didn't succeed in this attempt and came out after more than 10 hours in freezing water. But the Rolex watch still worked perfectly. This failure became Rolex's greatest marketing success, proving their watches could survive extreme conditions even when humans couldn't. 26 years after the Mercedes stunt, two men attempted to do what people had been trying for decades: climb the world's tallest mountain. What made this expedition different from all previous attempts wasn't that Edmund Hillary and Tenzin Norgay reached the summit of Mount Everest, but that Rolex provided watches to the expedition. Even though some evidence indicates the climbers may have actually worn Smith's A11 watches during the summit attempt, Rolex linked their brand with humanity's greatest climbing achievement. Their watches survived minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit at an altitude of 29,000 feet. This achievement made headlines around the world, and Rolex made sure everyone knew what watches they were wearing. This made Rolex more than a watch company. They began the brand that conquered the world's highest peak. And after this success, Rolex would now attempt to conquer the world's lowest depths. That same year, Rolex launched the Submariner, designed for underwater exploration. This time, Jacques Cousteau and his team were submariners, were filming underwater documentaries, proving that it doesn't matter where you are. Rolex watches will always work. This campaign didn't deliver what Rolex expected. The Submariner made money, but not as much as their previous marketing successes. But 13 years later, the biggest Submariner sales came from something that Rolex didn't plan. During the filming of the movie Dr. No, the lead actor Sean Connery wore a Rolex Submariner when he played the role of James Bond. James Bond was sophisticated, dangerous, and irresistibly cool, but most importantly, he wore a Rolex. Dr. No became a global phenomenon, and overnight, men around the world wanted to be James Bond. He made the Rolex Submariner become the ultimate symbol of masculine sophistication. It wasn't only in movies. Even before Hollywood stars made luxury watches cool, the most powerful men in the world were already wearing them. John F. Kennedy wore an Omega Speedmaster during his presidential campaign, and throughout his presidency, the leader of the free world chose Omega, making it the watch of American power and prestige. And on the other side of the Cold War, Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro wore not one, but two Rolex watches simultaneously, a GT Master and a Submariner. But celebrity endorsements and political approval would mean nothing in humanity's greatest challenge. The space race between America and the Soviet Union created the most extreme testing environments imaginable. NASA didn't care about marketing claims or being cool. They needed watches that could survive the vacuum of space, extreme temperature changes, and intense radiation. NASA tested dozens of timepieces from every major manufacturer, and all the big companies like Rolex and Omega submitted their best watches for brutal testing. Most fail immediately, but after years of failed tests, only one watch survives everything NASA throws at it. In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon wearing Omega Speedmaster watches. After surviving the most extreme conditions humans have ever experienced, the Speedmaster became known as the Moon Watch, the only timepiece tough enough for space exploration. And meanwhile, on Earth, Hollywood continued to redefine the definition of masculinity. Paul Newman started wearing a Rolex Daytona that his wife gave him. Steve McQueen wears a Tag Heuer Monaco in the racing film Le Mans. These weren't strategic placements. They were authentic choices by some of the coolest and powerful men on Earth. Everyone wanted to be like them, but just when the Swiss watch industry was on top of the world, and even out of it, it was about to face its biggest enemy yet. In 1969, during a trade show in Switzerland, the biggest Swiss watch companies were laughing at the new product of a Japanese competitor. Instead of using mechanical springs, it used a battery to work. This new watch was called Seiko Astron, the world's first quartz watch, and it's accurate within seconds per month instead of minutes per day, like its competitors. The biggest Swiss watch companies thought that this was just a gimmick that wouldn't be relevant. They thought people preferred traditional mechanical craftsmanship, but Seiko continued their plan and launched the Seiko Astron to the world, proving their competitors wrong. Just 6 years after the Seiko Astron presentation, Swiss watch employment had begun its catastrophic decline. 90,000 workers would eventually fall into just 28,000 by 1988. A $20 Timex quartz watch kept better time than a $10,000 Rolex. Historic Swiss watch brands that survived world wars and economic depressions went bankrupt. Factories that had opened for generations shut down. Master craftsmen were unemployed, and even some villages lost half their population as families moved away seeking work. By late 1980s, the entire Swiss mechanical watch industry was on life support. But during this crisis, a brilliant businessman realized something that would not only save the industry, but also create the modern luxury watch scam. In 1983, Swiss banks hired Nicholas Hayek to liquidate two dying watch conglomerates, a Swatch and SSIH. But instead of liquidating the companies, Hayek merged them and created the Swatch Group. Hayek's first move was brilliant. Launch Swatch, colorful, affordable Swiss quartz watches that compete directly with Japanese manufacturers. But his real strategy isn't the product. Hayek realized that Swiss brands couldn't compete on accuracy or price anymore, so he changed the game entirely. Instead of selling timepieces, Swatch would sell luxury, heritage, and status. Once again, watches became the sign of success. With this new strategy, Swatch sold 1 million watches in the first year. This repositioning strategy didn't just work, it saved the entire Swiss watch industry, but it also created the beginning of something much darker. Hayek's success with Swatch inspired a feeding frenzy. Between the 1990s and 2000s, three massive corporations began buying up every luxury watch brand they could find. LVMH acquires Tag Heuer, Richemont controls Cartier, Jaeger-LeCoultre, and Vacheron Constantin, while Swatch Group owns Omega, Breguet, and dozens of others. Combined, these three companies controlled 80% of the luxury watch market, allowing them to manipulate supply and demand across supposedly competing brands that were actually owned by the same companies. Rolex remained independent, giving it more control on its next strategy. These three companies, along with Rolex leading the way, started a 5-step scheme with only one purpose: create artificial scarcity to maximize profits. First, they limited production to far below the actual demand, intentionally limiting production far below what factories could actually produce. Secondly, they chose to control distribution through authorized dealers only. If you want a Rolex, you can only buy it from approved dealers who follow strict allocation rules set by the manufacturer. On the third step, They created artificial waiting lists through the dealer allocation systems, where popular models have a 2 to 5 year waiting time, not because they're impossible to make, but because the company gave limited quantities to each dealer. Lastly, they used the same marketing strategy that made watches successful in the first place. They started spending 25 to 40% of their sales on celebrities' endorsements, paying famous people like Roger Federer, Tiger Woods, and George Clooney millions of dollars just to wear their watches. And in the final step, they used social media manipulation and secondary market speculation. Instagram and TikTok flood users with luxury watch content designed to make anyone without a Rolex feel like a failure. While exact manufacturing costs are trade secrets, industry estimates suggest luxury watches sell for 5 to 10 times their production costs. This price covers the development and company profits, while also funds the massive marketing machine designed to convince people they need these products. Suddenly, luxury watches aren't just for old rich men. They're for anyone who wants to appear successful. And soon, the industry would attract a completely new type of buyer. On October 26 in 2017 in New York, a 1969 Rolex Daytona was sold for $17.8 million. Not because it was the most accurate timepiece ever made, not because it had revolutionary technology, but because it belonged to a dead movie star. Paul Newman's personal Rolex Daytona became the most expensive wristwatch ever sold at auction. This single sale changed everything. The $17.8 million sale from a watch less accurate than a $20 Casio convinced millions that luxury watches were the new gold. The Paul Newman watch sale proved that luxury watches could make people rich. Investors flooded the market, treating Rolex like stocks. But the biggest shift in this new market would be triggered by a worldwide catastrophe. In March 2020, the entire world shut down overnight. Stock markets crashed, unemployment skyrocketed. But while most investments were collapsing, something unexpected was happening in the luxury watch world. People who never cared about watches suddenly became obsessed with them, not because they needed to tell time, because they discovered watches could make them rich. Stuck at home with stimulus checks and nowhere to spend money, people started treating Rolex like the stock market. Popular models that retailed for $8,000 were suddenly selling for $25,000 on the secondary market. A Rolex Submariner that cost $8,550 retail in 2020 was flipped for $15,000 by year's end. Reddit groups like Our Watches exploded from 200,000 members to over 1.2 million. YouTube channels dedicated to watch investing gained millions of subscribers practically overnight. The scheme that began years earlier had evolved beyond anyone's control, creating an impact on society that continues to this day. Using celebrity culture, artificial scarcity, and psychological manipulation, the luxury watch industry convinced millions to pay luxury car prices for accessories less accurate than smartphones. But luxury watches weren't the only industry built on manipulating marketing strategies in historical crisis. Watch this video to discover how a cocaine-based remedy started the big soda empire we know today.